everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something I call Take the Doughnut, which for me is an expression that's the same as carpe diem. It means go after what you want. And the thing I wanted to go after this year was watching the show Halt and Catch Fire again, but this time actually talking about it with other people, which is a luxury I didn't really have before when I watched the show. So now we're up leveling that, and I'm getting a chance to talk with people who actually worked on the show. So today we have another amazing interview coming your way. And before I introduce my guest, quick note here, if you're new to the show, if you haven't seen the show all the way through before, the episode recaps are safe for you because I keep those spoiler free up until the episode you're watching. These interviews could be spoiler filled. Chances are this one's going to be really spoiler filled. So just know that up front. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of great things to hear coming out of this one, but if you don't want to be spoiled, maybe come back to it later. Having said all of that, I am so excited to introduce my guest for today, who is Thomas Golubić, who was the music supervisor for all 40 episodes of this show. So first of all, Thomas, welcome.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm very, very honored to be here. This is one of my favorite projects, and I think it's a joy to talk about it. I'm so glad that you've taken the mantle and are running with it because I think it's a really exciting part of television history.
Thank you for that. And I'm very excited for this conversation because I certainly have observed the music on the show, but haven't really had to dive deep into it in the way that we'll be able to in this conversation. So this is going to be a really fun look at an angle that I haven't really been able to provide much context on in the recaps. But before we get into any specifics, how did you get connected with this show to begin with?
Well, I got a call from Melissa Bernstein and Mark Johnson, who were executive producers in the show. We had worked together on Breaking Bad, and I had had an incredible experience and really enjoyed working with each other. That was sort of one of those rare, perfect projects where, like, you love everybody you work on it. It's incredibly challenging, and then it ends up being great just creatively, and then audiences notice it and find it. And that combination is rare, where you every part of it just is perfect. So they said we're doing a new TV series with two young writers who had written a pilot, and AMC was excited about giving them a chance to do the pilot. And so they said we'd love to have you come on board and help us figure out how we want to approach music. And then I said, well, what's the subject matter? How does it work? And they said, well, it's going to be a story about technology from 1983, and then we kind of go on from there. And I went to high school between 1983 and 1987, so it's a sweet spot for music discovery for me. And also, I love doing serious deep dives into getting history right and making sure I understand characters. I understand what the world that the characters live in are. So to me, it was an opportunity to not only dive in the music that I fell in love with in high school, but also to find what were the subgenres I was never even aware of? What were the worlds that I hadn't been exposed to yet that I got a chance to explore with these characters? So that was really exciting. And we were also looking to build a main title, to bring a composer on board. A music supervisor essentially has to cover every part of music for a show. That means from the very basic vision of finding out what the filmmakers want to do to being able to hire the right people or present the right composer options or lead that conversation in a way where people can understand the pluses and minuses and personality, combinations, things like that. And then there's also the source music in the show, which is identifying how music may be used, building a palette of sounds, and then being able to execute it by being able to license that music, and then making sure on the mixing stage everything is balanced for the best storytelling. So you're always an advocate for story and character, but your job is to find a way to tell that story with music.
What an involved task to have for a show that ends up going 40 episodes over 4 seasons and time jumps, like a lot of time jumps.
Mhm.
How far in advance of, let's say, shooting the first episode would you have been brought on board to start, I guess, prepping some of that work?
I would say probably weeks to months. I don't remember exactly what the time turnaround time was. I believe I was on from the very beginning, so I believe the pilot had not been shot yet, although history may prove me wrong. But basically, the real beginning for me was getting to know the characters, and so I started to really arc out my understanding of each of the leads and know the world of Joe and the world of Cameron, and know what each of the characters had maybe come from or where they were at this moment when we meet them. So part of understanding where someone is when you meet them is maybe sketching out a little bit about where they may have come from, what their back history might be. And some of that may have been inferred in the, scripts, but most of it was stuff that we were trying to discover together. So I do a lot of building of different ideas early on. And then we deal with anything which is practical, meaning that if a character sings to camera or hums along to something, a lot of times we'll want to select that ahead of time, have it cleared ahead of time, and know that we're going to make a bigger meal out of this music moment, but we can't change it in post production because we've committed to that character saying, that's my taste. That's the music I like to listen to. And that way we have a foundation for that character, and that helps us.
So you obviously have a ton of prep to do, and it sounds like your entry point was looking at it through each character. Were there any situations where, as the story continued to develop, you found, ooh, we're moving really far away from a direction that I had been prepping? Like anytime, I know we have time jumps, but especially as like scripts continue to come out, were there any major switches that happened for you along the way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest ones was really changing location when we moved from, Dallas, Texas, and suddenly we were in San Francisco. We kind of had to build a whole new palette, and the characters had changed dramatically too. When we get reintroduced to Joe, he's a very different person than he was when we were in the Dallas time period. So part of the fun of that was really digging deep into Dallas. That was important, and we knew that if we were in 1983, especially with the character Cameron, because Cameron to us was a serious music fan. She was the kind of fan that would like exchange tapes and would like have underground bands that people wouldn't know. She was not doing mainstream music. A lot of it was gonna be very local. So a lot of the early digging for her was taking a look at punk rock posters that existed in an art show that was happening. And we started to look up the names of the bands on the punk rock posters and see if there was any internet trail anywhere for some of these bands. And most of them there weren't. Some of them were people, we meet them and they say, oh, yeah, I was in a band, but we don't own anything. We don't even know who owns it. And we couldn't license it. And that was a shame. And then we found a few people that said, actually, I own the masters now, or I know who has the label and the publishing. I can probably help you with that. So we started to gather quite a bit of underground music, especially for Cameron, that hadn't really been licensed before, and kind of educate people in how that works and what they can expect and how we can basically paint the world authentically, because we did not want Cameron to look square or to have music that didn't speak to her character. And so that meant that getting the details right. But that was Dallas. When we got to San Francisco, we switched things up a little bit and we kind of evolved with the characters as well. So it's a double check. You're checking both your location, but you're also checking where are the characters now. What would they be listening to now? Would they be part of the existing culture in the new city, or would they be working in a nostalgic vein, or would they be completely counter to it? And each character had a different angle.
That seems particularly tricky with Cameron because, especially in those early years, because I mean, the research for that can't be casual. I mean, you're not just going to find an internet trail for an indie band in the 80s. Like, that's not a thing, which is the point of the show, really. So I think, obviously, you must have really had to work a lot of connections to sort of get access to the types of sounds that you wanted.
Yeah, we did a ton of research. Yvette Matoyer was working very closely with me on this project, and she and I just had a ball finding and really just digging deep. Like when we found the posters, we are like, this could be the golden ticket to finding what we're looking for, because we were shocked at how many indie sort of punk rock bands didn't have any representation. There was no catalog to license. It was like they disappeared from the planet, and we didn't want to be putting in music that wouldn't be truthful to her. Integrity is a key part of who Cameron is. So we knew that if we had a falseness to how the music telling her story would work, it would really hurt the character in a way. And so that was really key. it was easier with, someone like Scoot's character because in many ways, he was someone who had had his best time in the late 70s. The 80s was a hard time for him and not a time that he was necessarily turning to music. So in a way, there was a nostalgia looking backwards for him. With Joe, we were looking at somebody who was always ahead of the curve, always listening to new things, which helped us in a sense that we weren't going after big pop hits at all. We knew that that's not the world he would be in. It was just tricky to be able to afford a lot of music with the very small budget we had. And so it was a lot of it was about resourcefulness and finding what in that time period spoke to Joe's character and showed how ahead of the curve he was.
Hmm. It sounds like you had a lot of creative freedom in your role. What kinds of notes or directives would you have had from the Christophers or from the network that sort of infused into what you were doing?
I mean, I think one of the joys of Halt and Catch Fire was how collaborative it was all along. Nobody really dictated any specific sensibility to music. We knew we had to present different ideas, and as the Chris's began to resonate with certain ideas or certain tracks would really work, we knew that we were kind of together arriving to the right answers of like who Donna was or who Gordon was or who Cameron or who Joe were, and so I think it was the discovery together. It's like you when you work really well together with a team, a lot of times you don't really know where the answers come from. Sometimes somebody will throw something out in a meeting and you do some digging and you realize, okay, well, that's not affordable, but there is something really similar to that that is a great pathway. And then we sort of do some digging. And then when we throw that back in, suddenly everybody resonates and you realize, yeah, there was an excellent idea that came out of that meeting. We found a more practical application to that idea and that is now becoming part of the story, part of the texture and the fabric that we're building. But it's pretty mysterious, and you really have to. My feeling always is research, research, research. Just keep getting to know the characters, keep reading the scripts. You got to think of the show the same way the actors do. That the more you read the script, the more you know your lines, and the more natural you can be in delivering them because you're not intellectually trying to remember it. I do the same thing with the characters. If I feel like I really know them, it's easier to know the right answer when I listen to it. I can randomly go through thousands and thousands of songs and just know that could easily be in the world of Donna because she's a musician and because she was curious about music, but she wasn't able to explore it the way she wanted it to. And so that was like, there it is. And you just feel it. And at that point, you want to give 5 or 6 or 10 really strong options to the editorial team and to the Chris's and to the producers and the directors. And usually we came together to the right conclusions as a group. And I think that's kind of the joy of the process.
Hmm. What were you looking for in a composer? Because that's, creating stuff that nobody has ever heard before. What was the criteria for that?
That was tricky because part of our feeling was that we didn't need to hit the nail on the head on the 80s time period. And, I had certainly heard scores that were very 80s oriented or almost kitschy in how they make reference in a very self aware way of the 80s. We weren't quite sure how we wanted to really work it. So we tried actually a lot of different directions just to see. My general feeling is sometimes you don't need to put a hat in a hat. If you have an 80s era story, you don't need to necessarily have an 80s sensibility score. It can be sometimes distracting or even be limiting. But what we did find was there was something compelling about what felt modern in that time period. We wanted something that felt like it was a narrative storyteller, along with the cinematography and the costume design and the art direction, that was also telling the story. And when we, as we were digging, when we pulled Paul Hustlinger's music out, especially the work he'd done with Tangerine Dream and some of his original score work, there was something really great about how it managed to do both. It was oriented towards storytelling in a very subtle way. It was not showy in any way, and it also had a propulsive quality that carried each sequence. You always felt that you were moving forward through space. And I think once we did a meeting with Paul, another thing which really impressed me and I think really impressed the Chris's is less is more. He was not looking to soak every sequence with music, and he was very, vigilant about making sure that we always knew what we were communicating with music. We learned this in Breaking Bad, actually, previously, that when you don't know what the music is supposed to do, it's really good to look at not having music there. And as you strip everything out, and a show like Breaking Bad is made so well that you don't really need music to kind of fix mistakes or help a shaky performance, or oh wow, we barely see the characters talking because it was all fixed in ADR, and all these technical problems that audiences should not know about. Sometimes music is used to help to fix that. That was not the case for Halt and Catch Fire. We had already really strong scripts, really compelling performances, beautifully edited. So for us, it was, how do we best tell the story well? And Paul has a natural sense of minimalism and clarity of purpose, and is really good at not over dialing things to make things either sentimental or treacly. And so that meant that there was an integrity to the storytelling. And he was the right hire. He was the right guy for this.
Yeah, there's a lot of love for his work among fans of the show. And that sort of brings me to asking about the main titles, because what a big project and undertaking that like you kind of have to stake here's what the tone is going to be of the show from the very beginning, and hope that that stays true over all the seasons the show will run. A lot of shows now, some don't even, they take a second, put the title of the
Name
show
it.
on the screen,
That's
and then
it.
it's gone, and they forego it altogether. But these main titles, I would say, in my travels, I'm seeing a lot of love for the opening of this show. And what goes into that? It seems like a huge project.
It is. It is. Like, looking back on *Halt and Catch Fire*, I just realized what an enormous amount of work it all was. I think when you enjoy your job, it doesn't feel like work in the time period. The main titles, I'm blanking, unfortunately, on the name of the title company that did it, but they did an absolutely stunning job of it. It's a very unique looking main title, and it really captures both the concept of the technology, but in an organic kind of a structure, and it's very beautiful. We had some options with this. We knew that we could go the route of having the composer build a main title, and Paul did create some demos of it as well. But we also felt, because this show was very balanced between score and songs, it wouldn't be out of character for us to have a unique, bespoke piece of music built for the main title. So we reached out to a number of different artists. I'd done this also for a TV show called The Killing, and later for Better Call Saul. I love working on main title projects, and it's always good to have the composer build something as well. Sometimes that's the right answer, and you may build beautiful demos with really interesting artists, but ultimately you have to do what really fits the story best. In this particular situation, one of the artists that we reached out to, a Danish artist named Trent Muller, created something really exciting and dynamic. And as we got these drafts back, we worked with him to keep on adjusting and changing it, because I think both the length of the main title and also how the animation was working was changing over time. So we kept on tweaking and shifting. And I think in that process, it actually got stronger and stronger, because it felt more and more like it was stitching into the structure of the main title and the visuals as it went through. And now when I look at it, it's one of my favorite main title pieces. It's beautiful to look at. It really captures the tone of the series. It's very, very dynamic, and it's just a great piece of music. We were excited when we were able to include it in our soundtrack album and get it out into the world for those who were interested in music in the show.
Hmm. One of the things that you mentioned early on is that when you got started on the show, the first thing that you did was sort of tackle, who are these characters? And as you're organizing your thoughts, I suppose this is a very technical question to ask, but what are some of the ways that you organize that, especially if you know you're going to need to communicate your thoughts to other people so that a discussion can be had? How are you getting all of that organized?
That's an excellent question. It's changed a lot, actually. In fact, a turning point for me was the pandemic, because prior to the pandemic, my team would be in an office with me and we would listen to things together. And a big part of our process was playing music that all of us would bring to the table, and then talking through, how is it contributing to the storytelling? Is it landing well with a picture? Is it adding subtext? Are there lyrics that are helpful or interesting? Are there ways that we could cut it? With the pandemic, everyone's had to work remote, and so in doing that, how we've kept information has changed a lot. As far as collecting music, I left iTunes a while ago. I work on a Mac platform. iTunes stopped being a useful program at some point when it became a sales vehicle for new music, and all sorts of tech problems happened, and I found it deeply frustrating. So I stopped using it, and I use a program called Swinzian, which is essentially a mask of iTunes, but allows me to have lots and lots of folders that I can keep track of. So I would have, for every episode would have a folder, and then within that would be multiple playlists, and every round of ideas would be kept in there, and I could always refer back to those ideas. And a lot of times I would go into it and find an old idea from a radio show I'd done 20 years ago, and then I would see what else was in that playlist, and suddenly 3 or 4 other ideas were also valid or interesting, and then I would drag them in. So Swinzian, this sort of iTunes-like media player, became a key platform for me. And that would be a place I could pull ideas from. It's very associative. I also have, as you can see over here, a lot of vinyl. So I would kind of go to my old records, and I began to kind of pull things out as a way of just reminding myself. So whenever I was stuck, I would go through and see which records that I pulled out a couple inches and be like, oh, on the second side of this, there's a track right near the end that's a weird ambient piece, but it's got a very unique emotional tone. That might be an interesting idea that I could play with, and then I would either digitize it or find another copy of it, and then basically prep that. And I would work with our music editors who were key to this process. Jason Newman and his team at JTN were just stunningly creative and just the perfect collaborators. We worked together on Breaking Bad and also on this show, and their creativity also adds to that. But as far as the organizational part, it's a mix of using this platform, and then basically having emails which are very detailed with different, playlists. Now I use a program called Airtable, which I'm deeply in love with. It's a little bit like FileMaker Pro back in the day for people who remember that program. You can build your own database, but you can put information both visually and audibly with links and so forth. And I can now present different composers for different projects where you can see what they look like, see where they're based out of, what instruments they play, examples of their music, things that they pitched for the show. It's a really clean way of showing it. So if someone's engaged creatively, you give them lots and lots of resources to play with that they can listen to on their own. That way, when you all gather together, you can see who's really invested in the process and put real thought into it. And then the conversation really becomes about what's right for the show, what's right for the characters. It becomes less about, oh, I know that person, or this is my taste and it's different from your taste, but my taste wins because I'm higher up in the food chain. My job is really to bring the conversation always almost like a divorce attorney, bring it back to the children. What do the kids need? Like, how do we take our own individual picadillos about music, but talk about what would work for the characters and make sure that their choices resonate. And it's important for me in Halt and Catch Fire in particular was that I wanted each of the characters to be okay with the music that we presented. I didn't want to put music in that Donna wouldn't agree would be part of her character, not the actress, but the character. And so that's really important to me that the characters are also signing off. We're not giving prescriptive music to people. Oh, we think Cameron's this kind of cool. We presented who Cameron is with her music and wanted her character to be good with that too. So these are all little guiding things that you use to figure out, are we telling the story in the most effective way possible?
This is so interesting. I love hearing the detail of what goes into the process. And as you were talking, it almost made me think of, there's a character in season 4, Anna Chlumsky's character, who I believe the name is Katie.
Mm-hmm.
She's being interviewed by Joe and Gordon to take on a job with ultimately Comet, and they ask her, how do you sort your music? And
Mm-hmm.
she gives, I would call it a monologue about how she sorted somebody's metal collection.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it was an ode to you.
I can't speak to that, but there is something very beautiful about the weird mental illness of the collecting of art. Like I'm as bad with film collecting as I am with music collecting. So I have just thousands and thousands of films and lots of information on them, and it just spins in my head all the time. But yes, I think Anna's character is like a lot of serious music collectors, like very committed to the craft. And when you have this much music around you, having chaos is not really an option. So you tend to overcompensate by delineating really carefully. But the nice thing is you become very associative. Like I worked at a radio station for 10 years. And what I loved about that time period was getting lost in the library and just being like, today, I'm going to discover a bunch of stuff in the African section that I've never heard before. And I now have associations to what I like and what I don't like. And I would put little silver stars on the tracks that I liked so I could remember. So 2 years later, I could go into the African section, pull a second, I'll be, oh, silver star on the second to last song. That sounds like me. Let me put that on and see if it holds up. And that was a way for me to kind of track these things. And strangely, the brain has a tendency to organize for you. So if you help it a little bit, it makes life a little bit more, I don't know, enjoyable because you can find those great ideas more quickly. Digging around for a lost idea is a heartbreaking process for any craft.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about some specific scenes. And I know there's a number of songs that you wanted to highlight, and there's some that I'm keen to highlight. And the first one, I think there's going to be a lot of people who want to know about this one. So in episode 9 of season 3, so it's called Nim, and it's the second Condex episode. And we're going to get Joe and Cameron going to an Atari party, and there's going to be this gorgeous scene where they're dancing to Valoria by Pixies.
Yes, by the Pixies.
I mean, this scene is just perfect. So, like, I wouldn't change a thing. What went into this?
I mean, we knew a few things that were really important. This was a reconnection between Cameron and Joe, and in many ways, when they're together, you sense almost the inevitability of their destruction, but you also mourn the fact that they can't be together for very long, that there is a sense that they're meant to be a couple, both creatively and otherwise, and that it's also not meant to be for long. And so there was something so bittersweet about this reconnection between the two of them. And what I love so much about the way that episode was shot and the way it was written is that, for those of us who had the good fortune to be at some sort of a conference, some sort of like a live event, every once in a while there's a party there. And there's a bunch of plastic cups around and a DJ with, like, nowadays a laptop, but back then a couple turntables and a big crate full of records that would just spin music. And when you hear something for the first time in a crowd and you feel that sense of connection, that sense of joy, of discovery, of really being in the moment, that really just resonates. And I think for anyone who loves the Pixies, the Pixies is one of those bands that, they spurned a million bands. They're like the Velvet Underground. Like if you heard them, you wanted to start a band and you wanted to figure out how you could be as weird and wonderful and crazy as they were, in your own way. They really are, I think, a springboard. And to have Valoria, which is late in their career, it's not an early, discovery song, but it was appropriate for the time period. And to hear that song and the joy of that song and, Charles Thompson's voice and the way he just has this sort of California surf vibe with the song, but it's more than that. It's just something, I don't know, it's just a very unique piece of music. And I think the joy that you feel with Cameron and Joe dancing in that room and that sense of discovery was so special. And it's really, to me, what the show is all about. That moment of being in a new area, doing something no one's done before, not knowing if you're in the right place or the wrong place, or if you're cool or you're uncool, but just feeling joy and discovery and a sense of community. And that, to me, was what that song really kind of captured.
Ah, beautifully done. Thank you for putting that into the world. Season 2, the tone of the show has to shift a little, sometimes a lot, every new season. And so we open in episode 1, SETI, and there's this very complex looking, well choreographed oneer that happens that's tracking Donna around the house, the mutiny house. And you really need to feel a certain energy in that space because it's just, chaos reigns supreme, but so do ideas. And there's a lot of movement happening both in the camera work and, I guess somehow you have to try to capture that. And so this is set to Birds Fly by Icicle Works. And I get chills when I hear that song opening it up as she's going into the house. How was this one chosen?
Oof, I think this was chosen in editorial because I know that we had to build the sequence. I love how this show has a tendency to come in hard on their season openings. Like they are ambitious sequences. They really set a tone. We're in a new world here and we're getting to know new characters in a new place. And a lot of times we will do some early music ideas if we know, okay, this is going to be a featured needle drop, a featured music moment. We don't necessarily need to be playing as source. We're playing it over the scene and we're really pushing the scene forward with it. I have a feeling, and again, I'd have to dig through my notes to really be accurate, but I believe that was a batch of songs that were basically time period specific, but also we're trying to capture that sense of new horizons and that sense that something was changing. And to me, that song really is both a little bit of an underknown song, which I think was important to us. We didn't want to come in with a big hit. I don't think we could afford a big hit. So it was a lesser known track, but it was one of those songs that you can't deny that sense of exhilaration you feel with it. And throwing our characters into this new world, especially Cameron and Donna, was really just an exciting way to open up the season. And I'm so glad it's in the fabric of the show. You know, these are songs that I loved at one point or another, and I'm just so happy that they found a home that felt natural.
Yeah. So if we go back to the beginning of the show, if we look at the pilot, I'm obviously jumping all over the place with these, but this is in no particular order. So in the pilot, there's a montage that's going to jump between Joe and Gordon scenes, and it's set to the song "Complicated Game" by, is it XTC or
XDC,
Ecstasy?
XDC.
XTC.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, this song feels lyrically perfect for actually the entirety of the show. So walk us through this one. How was this one chosen? Because I'm not sure this was from the time period.
I want to say it was 81, 82, so it might have been a little bit earlier. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it's close. XTC is a band, for those people who knew them, and they were not as popular as a lot of the other 80s era bands were, but they were almost a Beatles-esque band in the sense that they were so good with melodies. They could create pop songs with just such ease. I love them. And this song, it's an unusual song. It has a tense kind of quality to it that it really kind of creeps up on you, and then it has these explosions of energy. But it's always constrained and it's always smart. And it's not punk, it's a different thing altogether. It's very much in the post-punk kind of world. And I think with Joe, we were really establishing that, you know, Joe he's a loose cannon in a sense. He's very arrogant, he's very comfortable in his own skin, he's a little too confident in a lot of ways, but he's also extremely smart. And you know that he's always on the risk of being ahead of his skis where he's going, and that sense of frustration and that sense of feeling trapped and needing to burst into something new was important to capture with him. And he was, I think, playing baseball in his little condo in that whole scene. And that was one of those things where I just literally went through my vinyl collection and pulled out a series of records and played things against picture. And that was really where that landed. It just felt like as soon as I hit the needle to the record and it started to play, I remember that it was just like every little moment just felt like it was informing further. And our music editor, again, made a beautiful kind of cut to close it all out to make it really feel natural. But a lot of that is trial and error. I'm always a little surprised, and that to me in particular, there's no reason that that song works. It just kind of does, and that's part of the fun mystery of this. It's like part science and a lot of magic.
Mm. If we go back to season two, so episode three called "The Way In," Gordon's gonna have a coding scene to the song "Good Morning Judge" by
Yes,
10cc.
yes.
I know you wanted to highlight this one, so what do you want us to know about it?
Well, this was kind of the fun thing of trying to figure out who Gordon is, right? Because we had used I wasn't Steely Dan, I want to say it was Boz Scaggs tune when he was driving in episode 2 or 3. I forgot where it was in the early part of the season. And we had kind of figured out that in a way, Gordon may not have listened to much new music in the last 3 or 4 years. So when we meet him, he's still a little bit trapped in another universe. That is the kind of odd band that I could see Gordon liking because it's a little bit cerebral. They're clever. But they're also still very much a sort of a rock band in a unique kind of way. Um, who have had a lot of interesting, sounds over the course of their career, but that song just felt like the kind of thing you could hear Gordon having next to a cup of coffee and feeling like that's the way his day begins. So I don't even know whether the lyrics make sense in the context. I don't think I even thought about that. A lot of times when lyrics land well, I view it as being accidental and not intentional. That I want the vibe first. I want it to feel real to the character and to that feeling first. And then if the lyrics do actually add in, then fantastic. That's a great added bonus. But I don't like to start with that. I always want that to be the unintended consequence. I think a lot of the worst music supervision is when someone's trying to say something with the lyrics. And, if you're listening to dialogue and then there's lyrics that are informing the same thing that the person's saying, it feels to me a little bit unnecessary. The hat in the hat problem. It's better
Hmm.
in many ways to get the vibe right. And then if it actually informs further, then you allow the audience to take that as where they want to.
Interesting. If we go to the next episode, so episode 4 of season 2, Play with Friends.
Mhm.
So the mutiny team has a Nerf dart battle, and the
Yes.
song "Don't Want to Lose" by XX is playing. What should we know about this one?
Not of the time period. It's a contemporary song. It was one of those situations that we kind of bounced around a little bit with being legitimate. We legitimate in the meaning that we'd have sometimes featured songs that were not of the time period. The rule that we had was we never play them as playing a source. So for that sequence, it was never played as source in the room. It's being played as an editorial choice, as a needle drop to kind of carry the audience through. But the feeling of that song really felt right to the characters and to the fun of it. And having a contemporary sound that is to some degree, maybe a little bit looking back in time, um, works. But I feel like in many ways, I really love the balance that we had. I like the fact that we were not always being very literal. The rule that we always stuck with is never play it as source if it's not source. So if it's a situation where we're pretending that they're listening to a song, it would always have to be of the time period. But beyond that, when we featured music as a whole, a lot of times we were able to feature things that were not specifically played as source or of the time period. And that was one of them.
Hmm. Hmm. I know there was another one that you wanted to talk about, which is from 2 episodes after that. So it was episode 6, season 2. 10 Broad 36 was the episode. So Joe is leaving a phone message for Sarah, and Lucky I Got What I Want by Jungle is playing.
Another contemporary track.
I thought this was an interesting choice because it feels like Joe, but then it has this, is that an organ in it that's like kind of, it's like a not Joe thing, but
Mhm.
within the Joe context. And so I was very curious about this choice and, what inspired it.
I mean, that's a good example of a situation where the integrity of the emotion is more important than the literal specific time placement. And in many ways, that's a sequence where Joe is like he's spinning in circles. He's calling his wife. He's trying to leave mess. He's trying to salvage a relationship is falling apart, and he knows it. And so I think in many ways, what is great about that song is it has this sort of hushed keyboard pattern kind of element that's moving, yearning, but not quite getting past things. In many ways, it's a parallel to maybe XTC's complicated game in a sense. It's a character trapped in amber in a way, and that song has a sort of hushed, threatening kind of quality to it. It's also slick in a sense. It's slickly produced. It has a sheen to it, which I think fits and allows us a little bit less sympathy for Joe in that moment, which I think is important. We balanced a lot in how we feel about our characters in that moment. We don't want to give them a sentiment that isn't appropriate to their character. And I think that that song captured his state, but in a way that was, I think, truthful to his nature, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I know those were songs that you wanted to talk about. I have a handful of my own if we have the time to,
Bring it on, bring it
do
on.
it. First of all, and this is going to be a little bit more, maybe there might be other considerations here, but in the beginning of season 3, episode 1, Valley of the Heart's Delight, we open it with Boz singing a Sinatra song.
Hmm.
What goes into that in terms of even just like getting the clearance to do something like that?
One of the things which is tricky, especially with Sinatra, is that Sinatra did not write all the songs that he is famous for. A lot of them were standards. And a lot of times the standards mean that even though Frank Sinatra might be the most well-known singer of a song or one of the well-known singers of the song, it could be tied to a publishing company that's willing to be more reasonable in their rates. It is always expensive when you're doing standards or well-known old tunes, but we also needed to have something that felt true to Boz. You know, Boz is such a distinctive character, and in a way, we didn't want to have something that wasn't speaking to him that he would know. And I think we lucked out. We essentially, reached out to a number of different publishers and asked them for songs that we could utilize that would sort of help to tell his story in a way, but would not cost us our entire music budget. That was in many ways one of the biggest struggles in the show was how do we make this all work with a really, really small budget? And I'm really happy and proud of what we did. And I'm sure that in retrospect, a lot of those limitations allowed us to have better solutions. But it does make moments like that very difficult because you have to, number one, find the songs that we think are going to speak to the character, make sure that they're affordable. In other words, presenting only the affordable options as much as possible, getting a selection made, then being able to kind of prep it for onset playback, giving it to the actor, giving the actor both an audio reference or even a vocal coach potentially to sing that song and kind of get it the right way. And then sometimes you have to do onset playback. So you might have to have an earwig or something that the actor can hear the song, they can sing along to keep track of it. It depends on each different performance how it's handled, but there's a lot to it. And at that point, also coverage is important because you got to make sure that if you're covering a character from different angles, that they're not changing where they are in the song at a different time. So there's a lot of technical components that have to get figured out. That's why there's a lot of strategy that goes into any on-camera performance. It's surprisingly complicated, and it's amazing how often when it's done poorly, how it really kind of shows and the audience disengages in a moment where they should really be leaning in.
Hmm. So there's a song I have to ask about. I'm from Long Island originally, and so I'm gonna have to ask about a Billy Joel song that was used in 304 Rules of Honorable Play. Gordon gets way too overzealous in a game of laser tag with the team,
Hmm.
and the song "Good Night Saigon" is playing. But that song, if you've heard the whole thing through, it's a very serious song, and it has a very slow start, and it builds to what you showed, what was cut into the show. It's such a serious song, and put in this context it kind of blew my mind. So it became like an extra funny scene
Hmm.
because of this incredibly serious song. What went into this?
I'm going off the top of my dome here, but I believe that was either scripted or was done in by put in by editorial. I don't remember exactly because it was not one of mine, and I think that is actually a good example where it is always exciting when someone has an idea, and even if it feels counterintuitive, one of the great things about that show was how brave we would be. Like some of the crazy ideas came from us, but sometimes they came from a writer or a director or the editor. And I think for us, it's like, okay, how can we afford it? Billy Joel is not inexpensive. It's going to be challenging to make that work. Is all that effort going to be worthwhile in the end? And obviously, from your response to it, it has. And I think that's sort of like the fun part of this process is being like, why would that ever work? But somehow it does. And we
That's why
land
it
there.
worked, because it shouldn't.
It shouldn't, right?
Like, I was like, what is happening with this song right
Yeah.
now?
It's 20% science and 80% magic. And you got to do the hard 20% of the science to get to the 80% of the magic, but
Yeah.
it's so worth it when it does.
Mm. So another season 4 episode 1 song from So It Goes, we're going to get a montage of Donna at a dinner party and Cam making herself comfortable in Gordon's house, and it's set to Doll Parts by Hole.
Mm.
And Donna changes a lot in season 4. She's coming off of a kind of serious trauma, I guess, with the team, and she's savage, and I imagine that completely changed your sound profile for her. So how did you go about choosing, let's say, this song, but also did you just kind of scrap everything you did up until then and start fresh for Donna?
I mean, I think, it's interesting with Donna because, there's I view it. Donna has some similarities in a lot of ways to the character Jesse Pinkman in Breaking Bad, in that when we first introduced Jesse Pinkman, it wasn't necessarily who he was, it was who he wanted people to think he was. So in a lot of ways, you're presenting a presentation, and that is a tricky balancing act to get right. With Donna, we had a few things that we knew. We knew that she had been a musician. We knew that she had listened to probably classical music, had some exposure to jazz. Um, tended to, I think that we also viewed her as being one of those people that got into jazz fusion and got into more almost new agey kind of sounds. We didn't get a chance to explore that much, but we always felt like that might be part of it. So where do you pivot to somebody who could easily be listening to like Spyro Gyra or these very kind of lugubrious sort of, fusiony kind of jam bands into something like Whole, which is radically different in a lot of ways? Maybe even just having a pivot like that establishes for a character a shift, you know? And, Courtney Love is not easy to clear. So we knew that there was going to be a lot of difficulties and cost and everything else involved. But I think one of the fun things of the show was every once in a while we were able to have something that just felt like it spoke to the character's shift in persona. And sometimes almost oversteering that shift is a way of establishing how rickety that change may be. That change may be an overcompensation, or it may be giving us an idea of where the character may lead in that time period. So I think that happened, and I don't know whether it happened strategically or not. A lot of times we just landed on the idea, and in retrospect, we can kind of look back and say, "Oh, wow, that kind of did that. It did stuff we didn't even notice it did at the time." But it's always tricky in hindsight to know how much of it was intention and how much of it was just a gut instinct that seemed to be the right idea and it was worth all the effort involved.
Hmm. And in the episode after Gordon's death, which
Mm.
is a very grief heavy
Oh my
episode,
God.
there's obviously a huge song choice that's made. Cam can't even decide what song to put on,
Right.
while they're basically cleaning out his house. And Donna picks So Far Away by Dire Straits. I mean, what song do you pick in that moment? So why was that one chosen for this?
I mean, I think it just said so much about Gordon in a sense, you know. It's a later part of Dire Straits' catalog. It's a huge album. And it's a record that, I think a lot of people knew only the hits from that record. MTV had played, one of their songs in a huge way in that time period. But the album itself is really, really beautiful. And as somebody who's always been a fan of Dire Straits, also Dire Straits is a band led by Mark Knopfler, who was a former educator. He left a career as a teacher to become essentially a pub musician and have his band explode. There's something similar in a lot of ways to Gordon in that is that Gordon is inherently sort of a cerebral guy who is trying to work in technology but may not really be necessarily designed for it, but does great things because of his perseverance and his hard work and his capacity to adapt and change. And I think that in a way, that song has a level of deep sweetness and sadness to it that really kind of, it's a love song, but it's a love song about somebody being gone. And I think in a way that really captured the feeling of Gordon's passing. I love those episodes around that. They're among my favorite hours of television I've ever worked on. And I think that anybody who really wants to experience Halt and Catch Fire, they have such a beautiful closing to the story because it's just handled so beautifully. And I think at that point, we're so invested in Gordon that when he passes, it's something that we are all kind of processing. And I think that song has a almost a warm hug to it in a way.
Beautifully said. And in that same episode, there's not I don't think there's a question here. It's just a thank you. Joe, there's this short scene with Haley and Joe in the car when they're going to Goodwill to get the sweater back,
Hmm.
and she's listening to something on her headphones, and he's like, "No, play it. It's fine. I want to hear what you're playing." And it's Fish Head by Barnes and Barnes, and that scene. At this point, I've watched it so many times that it shouldn't be able to make me laugh anymore. Every time it gets me. However, it happened. Thank you.
Oh, it's great. I mean, what's so nice is having those two characters in an emotionally fraught moment going to do an errand that is weighted with so much trauma, and to have that song be what pops out. And it's the honest truth of it that character her age in that time period, that is what they would have had. So in a weird way, it's kind of the best writing is when you have all the characters being themselves, but something incredibly funny is happening in the context of all that. Nobody is not being themselves. Nobody is not is doing something, prescriptive. Everybody is being natural, but there's something incredibly funny and heartwarming and sweet about that moment.
Mm,
Yeah, again, I love those episodes so much. I'd love to watch them again. I think, again, if you're getting a chance to get to know the show, to me, you have such a beautiful landing on it that if you have a hard time with the first season, which a lot of people did, because I think in many ways it was trying to figure out what it was, by the time you get to season two, it is a fully formed creature, and season three and four are just gorgeous deliveries of really beautiful storytelling. So proud
absolutely.
to be part of it.
Well, I know we're running short on time here. I have maybe one other question that I wanted to ask, if that's okay.
Please.
As a general note, it seems like when you hit season four of this show, we start getting a lot more songs by female singers or bands
Hmm.
than we did previously in the show, and the story is also heading in that direction as
Hmm.
well. And I'm curious, was this a product of the time period you were drawing from, or from the tone of the show, or something else? Like how did that evolve?
I think that was really very much, I think, the characters, in a way. The first season was very much kind of like Gordon and Joe, and then you had sort of Cameron and Donna as these sort of side characters with Boz kind of floating around. And I think that as the show pivoted towards having equal weight towards Donna and Cameron, the show really in many ways moved past the guys and followed them more. And they became, even when they parted as partners, they were still really driving the narrative of the story. And I think that one of the things I really love about that shift and that transition was it was really kind of leaning into your strengths. That in many ways, the discovery of Cameron as a boss and the discovery of Donna as a boss and as somebody who is an innovator is a very interesting challenge. Where if we had sort of recycled the same Joe and Gordon stories in season two, three, and four, the show may have lost a lot of its momentum. But I think the Chris's were so smart in how they kind of leaned into each of the different actors and characters and how the stories moved. And I really get the impression that the story itself asked to shift over to Donna and Cameron in many ways, and we just simply pivoted along with that because that felt like the right move to make. And I'm sure there are times when you're the number one person on the call sheet and you've got less lines and you're less about the plot machinations than before. That can be a little bit heartbreaking, but I think this team in particular are such great team players that you really never felt that there was any sense that the evolution wasn't one that we were all doing together. And that to me shows for both the humility and also the passion for all the cast members, all the writers, all the directors, and the producers to take this story the way it naturally wanted to go and bring it to this really, I think, beautiful conclusion.
Mm, that's so well said. Are there any last things that come to mind for you that you wanted to share about this show, that we didn't get to talk about yet?
Oh man, I mean, it was really, like I said, teamwork was really key. Like I did this project with Vet Matoyer and several other of my team members, and they all added ideas. Michelle Johnson did, Garrett McElver did. Everybody added really exciting and interesting ideas. Jason Newman and the music editors from JTN were constantly finding ways of taking maybe difficult ideas and making them work at times, which is really important. And it's like the invisible art of music editing. The editors on the show are so talented and we're just bringing in their own passion and curiosity. And, our job was really to have each department fall in love with different ideas and for us to always be able to have new ideas whenever the first set of ideas didn't resonate for one reason or the other, never to be precious, always find another solution. And I think you really sense that with everybody in every department. Everybody really got a chance to do their best work because we all knew we were doing something special and we all really liked and respected each other. And that's just a great gift. I mean, again, I'm so happy you're doing this podcast because to me, this is a journey I really look forward to sharing with somebody, and of starting the show over and having them see it for the first time and getting a chance to re-experience these things, because when we're doing them, we're so in deep in the trenches. We barely know why things work. We just know that we're trying our best to be open creatively and to deliver ideas that excite others. And so when you see that resonating with a new audience, that's just the greatest gift.
And I think fans of the show, of the many things fans enjoy about this show, the music of this show is absolutely something that comes up a lot. So, it worked for so many of us. Is there anything, what are you working on now? Or is there anything that you want to share with us about what you're up to?
Oh, sure. I'm working right now on Vince Gilligan's new project for Apple, which is unbelievable. It's like nothing I've ever worked on, nothing he's ever done before. We can't really speak about the project at all, but it is it's the greatest baseball team, in the world, and I get a chance to play a small part in it. It's just a joy. I'm working with Melissa Bernstein, who is one of the producers on this show, on a TV series, an HBO series called Get Millie Black, which takes place in Jamaica and has a Jamaican police detective narrative, which is pretty incredible. So I get a chance to dig in the crates for all my favorite Jamaican music, which is incredible. I'm working on Silo, which is an Apple series. That is with a wonderful collaborator, Graham Yost and Michael Dinner, who are just lovely filmmakers and lovely human beings and a joy to work with. Um, all those projects are coming forward. Mayfair Witches will be coming soon. We're doing SEAL Team, the final season of SEAL Team. And we have lots of fun stuff ahead of us. Poker Face season 2 will be forthcoming. I get to work with Ryan Johnson, who is just a incredible filmmaker and just a joy to work with. I feel very lucky. I love my job and I love working hard. I love training people. I love contributing. And when you have filmmakers who are open minded and curious and excited by what you can bring to the table and encouraging, it really helps you do your best work. So I'm happy I still have that drive and that excitement, and hopefully there'll be great things to come.
Thank you so much for all the time that you took to I mean, I've been so selfish in asking so many questions here, and I am blown away at the amount of recall that you have about a
Oh,
project that you did so many years ago. It just, oh my gosh. I think this just goes to show everybody, people who worked on this project loved this project. And, it's so fun to see your level of memories about this, and how much thought went into every single choice that was made. So thank you so much for just sitting down and talking through all this with me.
my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and keep up the good work. I'm so glad that you're sharing your joy for the show, and hopefully more people will discover it or rediscover it or just take the adventure with you. So thank you for all of your service and that beautiful vision.
Thank you for that. And okay, everybody, you know what to do. Go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire. Okay. Bye.
Bye.